The heavy doors of VFW Hall post 1031 groaned on their hinges as I pushed them open that Wednesday afternoon. The air hit me like a physical force, stale beer, floor wax, and the thick, suffocating musk of men who'd stopped trying decades ago. Yellow light from nicotine-stained fixtures cut through a haze of dust, and framed photos of old wars hung crooked on wood-paneled walls that hadn't seen fresh paint since the Reagan administration. A neon Budweiser sign above the bar buzzed and flickered, casting a sick red glow over everything it touched. I scanned the room the way I'd been trained: exits, 2, front and emergency behind the pool table. Occupied tables, 5, immediate threat. 1, my father, Carlos Gomez, was holding court in the far corner booth with his usual audience. Old Hank, 70s-something, a retired assembly line worker whose hands shook so badly he needed 2 tries to lift his beer. And Rusty, a 62-year-old former truck driver who'd lost his CDL to a DUI 3 years back and now spent his disability checks on $12 pitchers and bar peanuts. 3 men in wrinkled flannel and dirty ball caps hunched over brown bottles like they were guarding the last scraps of their dignity. My father had his elbows spread wide on the table, claiming territory the way he always did, making himself big in a small room. He was wearing his old Carhartt jacket, the brown one with the ripped left pocket he refused to replace because he said it had character. His hands were wrapped around a bottle of Bud Light, his thick fingers spotted with engine grease that no amount of lava soap could ever fully remove. I walked toward them, my pace measured, my posture straight, my Italian-cut blazer buttoned once at the waist. Every step on that sticky linoleum felt like crossing into enemy territory wearing the wrong uniform. The regulars at the bar turned to look. A woman in a flannel shirt narrowed her eyes at my clothes. The bartender, a heavy man with a towel over one shoulder, paused mid-pour and stared. I stopped at the edge of their booth. "Hey, Dad." He didn't stand. He didn't reach for a hug. He didn't ask how my deployment went or whether I was safe or whether I was tired from the flight. His eyes dropped from my face to my clean hands, then tracked down to my polished shoes, then crawled back up to the crisp collar of my shirt. His lip curled and I watched the disgust register on his face, the same way I watched instrument warnings register on a cockpit panel. Data received, threat assessed. "Speak of the devil," my father boomed, slapping the table so hard the bottles jumped and Hank spilled beer down the front of his flannel. He twisted his body toward his buddies, pointing a thick finger at me like I was a zoo exhibit. "Gentlemen, my daughter Sarah, look at her all dressed up like she's heading to a funeral. She's back in town, still playing that little flying game. Sky taxi driver, that's all." The booth erupted. Hank's laugh was a wet, rattling cough that belonged in a hospital ward. Rusty slapped his knee and shook his head, the kind of headshake that said he'd seen it all and couldn't believe the world was still producing this kind of foolishness. My father leaned back, arms spread wide, basking in the laughter the way a man basks in a standing ovation, feeding on the only currency he had left, the ability to make someone else the joke. I stood there, my stomach tightened into a fist. The laughter bounced off the wood-paneled walls and hit me from every angle. 20 years of service, 3 combat logistics deployments, a CEO title, a fleet of aircraft, 50 families on my payroll. And in this room that smelled like spilled beer and broken promises, I was a girl playing dress-up. "That's not a taxi service, Dad. It's a strategic air logistics fleet," I said, my voice flat, stripped of all inflection. "A status report, not a plea." He waved his hand like he was shooing a stray cat off the porch. "Whatever, a driver is a driver, the computer does everything. Autopilot, auto-land, auto-think, all she does is sit in the front seat and push buttons. Don't break a nail up there." He nudged Rusty and winked. Rusty pointed a filthy finger at me, grease caked under every nail, a man who hadn't held a legitimate job in 3 years, telling a decorated Air Force officer what real work looked like. "The supermarket downtown is hiring cashiers. Now that's a real job." Hank wheezed out another laugh and nodded so hard his ball cap slipped down over his eyebrows. "He's right, you know, got to get your hands dirty to call it work. All that sky stuff, that's just tourism with a fancy hat." My right hand slid toward my breast pocket. My military ID and my CEO business card sat there pressed against my chest like loaded rounds. 2 pieces of laminated proof that could end this entire performance in 5 seconds flat. I could feel the sharp edges of the cards against my fingertips, and every cell in my body screamed at me to pull the trigger. But I looked at my father's hands. They were shaking, not from anger, but from the 3 bourbons he'd already put down before noon. His fingers were scarred, swollen at the knuckles from arthritis he refused to treat. The hands of a man who'd spent 40 years in a repair shop and had nothing left to show for it, except the right to sit in a VFW bar and call his own daughter a failure. Tearing him apart in front of Hank and Rusty wouldn't teach him anything. It would just give him a new grievance to nurse with his next drink. I pulled my hand back. I straightened my blazer. I executed a perfect about-face, the kind they drilled into us at the academy until our heels cracked from repetition, and walked out through those heavy double doors into the cold Ohio air. The parking lot was grey, cracked asphalt spotted with oil stains and dead leaves. Behind me, the laughter of defeated men faded into the walls of a building named after veterans who actually fought for something. I didn't look back. Not once. That was the bar, but the real war zone was 6 blocks away at 412 Maple Street, the dinner table where I'd eaten every meal for the first 18 years of my life. My mother, Maria, set a platter of meatloaf dead center on the table. The grease pooled at the edges and soaked into the paper towel underneath like blood spreading from a wound. The kitchen smelled heavy, the kind of heavy that sticks to your clothes, follows you out the door, and rides in your car for days. Overcooked onions, rendered fat, cheap store-brand mustard, and beneath all of it, the permanent low-grade smell of a house where windows were never opened because fresh air might let in a conversation nobody wanted to have. My mother moved between the stove and the table with the efficiency of a woman who'd mastered the art of being useful without being noticed. She set down 3 plates, 3 forks, 3 knives, 3 glasses of water, and not a single word. I sat in my old chair, the one closest to the hallway so I could leave fastest. The wood creaked in the same place it had creaked when I was 14. The wallpaper behind my father's head was peeling at the seam, curling away from the drywall like it was trying to escape. The overhead light buzzed at a frequency that drilled into the base of my skull. I cleared my throat. I just signed a $247,000 medical transport contract. Critical organ deliveries. We're transporting hearts, livers, kidneys to transplant centers across the eastern seaboard. A matter of life and death. My father's head snapped up from his plate. He was chewing with his mouth open, a piece of meatloaf visible between his teeth. He reached for his steak knife and pointed it directly at my face, the tip hovering 6 inches from my nose, close enough that I could see the grease smeared on the blade from the meat he'd just cut. Contracts. Does your company have a shop floor? Do you make anything you can actually touch? Or do you just tap keys in an air-conditioned room all day while real men sweat? I swallowed the defensive reflex that crawled up my throat like bile. We have aircraft hangars, maintenance bays, and we use advanced logistics systems to calculate life and death flight windows. Sir, I replied, keeping my voice locked at the same temperature as a cockpit altimeter, cold, precise, stripped of everything personal. He spat the word out like it left a bad taste. Logistics. He dropped the knife and spread his hands flat on the table, claiming the surface the way he claimed every conversation in every room he entered. I worked in a shop for 40 years, Sarah. I bled for every part I fixed. Stitches in my thumb, burn scars on my arms, a bad back from crawling under trucks. You just float around up there in the sky, tapping a screen, playing pretend. Logistics. Give me a break. My mother picked up the ketchup bottle and moved it 2 inches to the left. Then she moved it back. Then she smoothed her napkin, her contribution to the conversation. I set my fork down carefully, lining it up parallel to the knife. Parallel, precise, the only kind of control I was allowed to exercise in this house. Last week, I flew through a Category 3 storm to deliver a liver to a transplant center in Virginia. A 7-year-old girl was going to die in 4 hours without it. He rolled his eyes, his entire head tilted back and his mouth twisted into that familiar sneer, the one I'd memorized the way a pilot memorizes emergency procedures, not because I wanted to, but because recognizing the pattern was the only way to survive it. There you go again, making everything sound like a movie. He leaned forward, jabbing the air between us with a calloused finger. You know Jimmy next door, the plumber. Yesterday I saw him waist-deep in mud and raw sewage, sweat pouring off him in the dead heat, fixing a busted mainline for the whole block. That is real labor. He fixes things that are real. Your hands are too clean, you're nothing without your computer. The steak knife lay between us on the table. My mother stared at her plate, pushing meatloaf around with her fork, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line that she probably thought looked like a peaceful smile. She wouldn't speak. She never did. She'd perfected the art of being present without existing, and I'd spent my entire childhood watching her do it, learning exactly what kind of woman I would never allow myself to become. I looked down at my own hands resting on the table. the same hands that had pulled 4Gs in a banking turn over the Atlantic, the hands that signed paychecks for 50 families every 2 weeks, the hands that had gripped a yoke through wind shear that would have scattered Jimmy's plumbing truck across 3 counties, hands that were apparently worthless because they didn't have sewage under the fingernails. I stood up, my chair scraped against the cracked linoleum with a sound like tearing fabric. I'm full. My father barked from behind me, his voice hitting the back of my neck like a thrown object. You're running away. Go back to your room and play on your phone like you always do. My mother finally spoke. Honey, she's just tired from the flight. Her voice was the same soothing, empty tone she used for everything, a verbal anesthetic designed to numb the pain without treating the wound. I didn't turn around. I walked down the narrow hallway toward my old bedroom, my footsteps slow and deliberate, my shoulders squared, my spine straight. But inside my chest, a cold, silent fury locked onto its target with the precision of a radar-guided missile. And this time it wasn't letting go. I stepped into my childhood bedroom and closed the door behind me. The room smelled like dust, old carpet, and the stale, sealed air of a space that had been abandoned and forgotten. My hand found the light switch on muscle memory, the same spot on the wall where it had always been, 4 inches to the right of the door frame. The overhead bulb flickered twice, sputtered, then held. My training kicked in before my emotions did. Something was wrong. The wooden shelf above my desk, the shelf where I'd displayed every model aircraft I'd built from age 11 to 17, was completely bare. Not rearranged, not reorganized, empty. Bare wood with rectangular dust outlines where the display stands used to sit, like chalk marks at a crime scene. I dropped to my knees and looked under the bed. A battered cardboard box was shoved against the wall, half hidden behind a stack of old yearbooks and a broken humidifier. I dragged it out. The cardboard was soft, damp from years of sitting against the cold foundation, the corners crushed and the tape peeling. I read the lid, scrawled in my father's aggressive handwriting in thick black marker, pressing so hard the cardboard was dented, were 2 words, old toys. I pulled the lid off. My hands were steady. Inside was a graveyard. The F-14 Tomcat I'd built over 3 weekends when I was 13, painting each panel line with a toothpick dipped in enamel, broken. The left wing snapped clean off, the landing gear ripped out, paint scratched in long gouges like fingernail marks. The SR-71 Blackbird, the one I'd saved 4 months of lawn mowing money to buy from the hobby shop on Route 40, crushed flat. Its fuselage cracked down the center like a broken spine. The C-130 Hercules, the model that made me fall in love with cargo aviation, the one that made me look at the sky and think I want to do that asterisk, missing all 4 propellers, snapped off at the shaft. He hadn't just stored them, he'd destroyed them. Then he'd labeled the wreckage and shoved it under the bed where it could rot in silence, just like every other dream I'd ever tried to build under this roof. I set the box down on the floor. My breathing was steady. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. Tactical breathing. The same rhythm I used when turbulence threatened to rip the airframe apart at 30,000 feet. The same rhythm I used when the altimeter screamed and the wind shear alarm blared, and the only thing keeping 70 tons of metal in the sky was the steadiness of my hands and the discipline in my lungs. I stood up and pulled open the junk drawer of my old desk. The metal runners squealed. Inside was the debris of a forgotten life, dead batteries, dried-out rubber bands, a broken pencil sharpener, a tangle of old phone chargers for devices that no longer existed, a stack of expired coupons my mother had clipped and never used. I reached past all of it, digging to the very back where my fingers touched something soft. Velvet. I pulled out a small flat case and opened it. My Distinguished Service Medal, earned during a combat logistics drop that had put my crew and me 45 seconds from a mid-air collision with a mountain ridge in 0 visibility. 45 seconds, the time it takes to brush your teeth. That was the gap between my crew living and my crew dying. And I closed it with my hands on the yoke and my eyes on the instruments and my voice giving commands that left no room for hesitation. The ribbon was creased. The pin was bent at a slight angle. The velvet lining of the box had a coffee stain soaked into the left corner, a brown ring that told me someone had used this box as a coaster. He'd shoved my Distinguished Service Medal in the junk drawer of my childhood desk, buried under dead batteries and expired coupons like it was a grocery store receipt from 2003. I lifted the medal out with 2 fingers and held it up to the weak bedroom light. The metal caught the yellow glow and threw a small, sharp reflection onto the ceiling. I rubbed my thumb across the cold surface of the ribbon, feeling the ridges of the weave. the texture of recognition from a nation he claimed to love, but whose standards of sacrifice he couldn't begin to comprehend. He wanted me to break. He wanted the tears. He wanted me to come running downstairs holding this medal, asking him why, begging him to tell me it mattered, proving to him once and for all that I was still the 12-year-old girl who lost her bicycle key and cried, until someone came to fix everything for her. He wanted me to ring the bell. That was his whole game. Push her until she quits, prove she's weak, confirm the story he'd been telling himself and his bar buddies for 20 years, that his daughter was soft, delusional, playing a game she didn't belong in. I placed the medal dead center on the desk. I positioned it precisely, the ribbon straight, the pin facing forward, centered on the wood like a flag planted on a captured hill. The daughter who craved his love died right there in that bedroom, standing over a junk drawer full of dead batteries and a box of crushed models labeled in her father's handwriting. I walked out and locked the door behind me. My face was stone. My pulse was 62 beats per minute. The mission had changed. The next morning, his rusting Ford F-150 groaned and rattled over the potholes leading to the private FBO terminal on the edge of town. The exhaust pipe coughed blue smoke. The bench seat springs dug into my lower back through cracked leather that had been patched with electrical tape. The cab smelled like motor oil, stale coffee, a pine tree air freshener that had stopped working 3 years ago and now hung from the rearview mirror like a shriveled green corpse, and the faint, permanent stink of brake fluid that had seeped into the floor mats. He complained the entire drive, about my spending habits, my lifestyle, the way I dressed, the way I spoke, the kind of people I associated with. His thick, scarred fingers strangled the steering wheel at every turn, white-knuckled on the cracked rubber grip, veins standing out on the backs of his hands like cables under tension. We pulled onto the ramp of the private terminal, and there it was, the Learjet 75 Liberty. $13 million of precision-engineered American aviation parked on clean white concrete. Its polished fuselage reflected the morning sun so sharply it made you squint. Swept wings, twin Honeywell turbofan engines, a tasteful navy stripe running from nose to tail, and my company name printed in silver lettering just below the cockpit windows, Gomez Aero Logistics. My name, my bird, my kingdom. His truck leaked a widening puddle of black oil onto the ramp concrete directly beneath the shadow of the jet's left wing. The contrast was so obscene it didn't need a caption. He cut the engine. The truck shuddered and died with a metallic cough. He stomped out, slamming the door so hard the side mirror rattled, and a flake of rust fell from the wheel well. He didn't walk toward the terminal. He walked straight at my aircraft like a man walking into a bar fight. He rapped his knuckles hard against the fuselage, 3 sharp, violent knocks that echoed across the tarmac. He leaned back, squinting at the composite skin like a building inspector looking for code violations. Then he raised his steel-toed work boot and kicked the front landing strut. A dull, heavy thud echoed across the empty ramp. The strut absorbed the impact without moving. It was designed to survive a 40,000-pound touchdown at 130 knots. His boot was not a factor. Flimsy plastic, he muttered, wiping the grease from his knuckles onto his jeans. Fragile toy, one bird strike and this thing shatters, nothing like solid steel. The cabin door lowered on its hydraulic arms, smooth and quiet, the engineered hiss of precision machinery. Matteo, my co-pilot, stepped down in his razor-sharp uniform, creases pressed to regulation perfection, shoes polished to a gloss. He snapped to attention, heels together, chin up, back straight. "Good morning, Major. The flight is prepped and ready for departure." His voice carried across the tarmac, with the crisp, clean authority of a man who understood chain of command the way he understood oxygen pressure at altitude, as a non-negotiable condition of survival. My father flinched at the word Major, then his face twisted into a sneer. He waved Matteo off with the back of his hand. "Cut the act, kid, Major this, Major that, it's just a sky taxi ride. No need for the theatre acting like she actually commands a military." Matteo's jaw tightened, a single muscle in his cheek flexed, his eyes flicked to me. I gave him one look, one barely perceptible shake of my head. "Stand down, Matteo, not your fight." He held his salute for 2 more seconds, then pivoted sharply and disappeared back into the cabin, professional to his last step. My blood pressure spiked. I could feel my pulse hammering in my temples, in my wrists, in the tight space behind my eyes. But my face remained glacial, locked behind the same mask I wore when instruments failed at 14,000 feet, and the only thing between my crew and a smoking crater was the composure in my voice. "Dad, conduct yourself professionally. No inflection, no warmth, no plea, an order." At that exact second, 3 black Cadillac Escalades glided onto the tarmac in tight formation, their tinted windows reflecting the morning light like polished obsidian. The lead vehicle stopped precisely 20 feet from the jet's boarding stairs. Doors opened in perfect sequence. Men in dark suits, earpieces, and mirrored sunglasses stepped out, scanning the perimeter with the disciplined, sweeping efficiency of a Secret Service protective detail. My father's mouth snapped shut. His hand found the rusted bed of his truck and gripped it, steadying himself the way a man grabs a railing during an earthquake. Genuine panic flickered behind his eyes, a blown fuse sparking behind a wall. General Arthur Vance stepped out of the center Escalade. 4 stars, 40 years of command authority, a man whose signature had repositioned carrier groups and whose voice had ended careers. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and walked toward the jet with the slow, deliberate stride of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to fill a room. I snapped my heels together and threw a razor-sharp salute. "General Vance, welcome aboard, sir." He smiled, returning the salute with a warmth that made me stand taller. A commanding officer acknowledging a peer, not a subordinate, a handshake between equals. But before the moment could settle, my father shoved my shoulder with his forearm and lunged forward, thrusting his black, grease-smeared hand at the general like a battering ram. "Hey there, I'm Carlos, her dad." He pumped Vance's hand with the aggressive enthusiasm of a car salesman closing on a nervous buyer. Vance looked down at his palm. Black grease was smeared across his skin. Fingerprints were already soaking into the starched cuff of his dress shirt. He calmly completed the handshake and released. My father leaned in, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial stage whisper loud enough to be heard in the next county. "Good luck up there. Hope she doesn't fly into a cloud. This girl is always spacing out. She's fooling you, sir. When she was 12, she lost her bicycle key, cried her eyes out, didn't know what to do. I had to go cut the chain for her. Keep an eye on her or she'll drop the airplane keys." He laughed, slapping his own thigh. He was the only one laughing. General Vance reached slowly into his breast pocket. He pulled out a pressed white handkerchief. He deliberately wiped the grease off his hand, then turned his attention to the stain on his cuff, rubbing it once, folding the cloth and placing it back in his pocket. His eyes never left my father's face during the entire operation. The silence was surgical. He didn't acknowledge the joke. He didn't acknowledge the man. He erased him. "Major Gomez, we are cleared for departure," Vance ordered, turning his entire body toward the boarding stairs and walking away from my father as if he had simply ceased to exist. I pivoted toward the jet. A vice grip clamped onto my left bicep. 5 calloused fingers dug through the fabric of my blazer and crushed into the muscle. My father yanked me backward hard enough that my heel skidded on the concrete. His sour breath hit my face, bourbon and meatloaf, and the rotten, desperate stench of a man who could feel his own irrelevance closing in on him like the walls of a shrinking room. "You think this little act fools me?" he hissed, his fingers grinding deeper. "I know you rented this plane. You hired that actor to call you Major." A distinct snap echoed somewhere behind my sternum. Not a sound anyone else could hear, just the clean, permanent fracture of the last filament of patience I'd been carrying since the VFW bar, since the dinner table, since the junk drawer, since the day I was born into a house that treated my dreams like garbage and my accomplishments like threats. I ripped my arm from his grip with a single, violent motion. I brushed my sleeve where his fingers had been, slowly, deliberately, with absolute contempt, the way you brush debris off a flight suit after a hard landing. My eyes locked onto his, and what he saw looking back at him was not his daughter. It was a commanding officer who had identified a hostile element and was about to neutralize it. "Board the aircraft, Mr. Gomez." His mouth fell open, his grip hand hung empty in the air. "What did you just call me?" I leaned in close enough that he could count the cold, flat pixels in my eyes. "You are a passenger. The flight departs in 5 minutes. If you are not on board, I will leave you standing on this tarmac." I pivoted on my heel and marched up the metal stairs. Each step rang against the aluminum like a hammer strike. I settled into the left seat, pulled the 5-point harness across my chest, and clicked every buckle into place with the mechanical precision of a soldier gearing up for combat. The cockpit sealed around me like armor. I flipped the master avionics switch. The instrument panel lit up green. Behind me, I heard his boots on the stairs, slow and heavy, the defeated footsteps of a man who had just been stripped of every rank he'd ever given himself. The border was closed. We leveled off at 30,000 feet. The sky outside my windshield was a deep, bruised purple. that thin, breathless line where the atmosphere gives way and the air stops being something you breathe and becomes something you survive. The twin Honeywell turbofans hummed behind me at cruise thrust, a steady, low-frequency vibration that I could feel through the yoke, through the rudder pedals, through the seat, through my spine. Altitude locked, heading locked, airspeed locked, fuel flow nominal. Every system under my direct control was green, stable, and performing exactly as designed. Everything except the cabin behind me. Through my headset, wired into the cabin intercom, I heard every word. My father had located the wine cabinet within 3 minutes of reaching cruise altitude. He'd uncorked the Bordeaux, the same bottle I reserved for clients whose charter fees ran 6 figures, poured himself a generous glass, and was now slumped in the aft leather seat like a man who'd paid for the privilege, instead of a man who'd been dragged aboard against his will. Sour wine, my father's voice barked through the headset. He slammed the crystal glass down on the mahogany side table so hard I heard the wood groan. Overpriced garbage, just like everything up here. Soft leather, soft music, soft drinks. You know what real work tastes like, General. It tastes like blood and engine grease and busted knuckles. Like Jimmy the plumber crawling through sewage to keep the whole block from flooding. That's a man. Up here it's all fragile nonsense. Toys for people who are scared of dirt. I gripped the yoke, the leather squeaked under my palms. He kept going. The Bordeaux was a fuel injector for every resentment he'd stockpiled over 3 decades. His voice rose. He crossed his legs, bouncing one dirty boot against the armrest with a rhythmic thud. Red wine sloshed over the rim and dripped onto the carpet. My carpet. My aircraft. My reputation bleeding out onto a floor that cost more per square foot than his truck was worth. And Sarah, sitting up there in the cockpit pressing buttons. He scoffed, jerking his thumb toward the cockpit door. He turned to Vance with the exaggerated familiarity of a man who believed that sharing an enclosed space with someone made them friends. She's useless without the computer, General. I'm telling you, without the machines, our corpses would be rotting in a cornfield by now. I heard Mateo's breathing change beside me. His right hand curled into a tight fist on his thigh, his knuckles going white. I gave him a single look. One word: hold. I reached my absolute limit. My hand moved to the autopilot panel. I toggled the switch. The yoke stiffened as the flight computer took authority. I unbuckled my 5-point harness, each clasp snapping open with a metallic click that sounded in the quiet of the cockpit like rounds being chambered. I placed my hand on Mateo's shoulder. You have the aircraft. I have the aircraft, he confirmed, his hands already on the yoke, his voice tight with controlled anger. I stood up, ducked through the narrow cockpit door and stepped into the cabin. I didn't sit down. I stood at parade rest, feet shoulder-width apart, hands clasped behind my back, shoulders square, chin level. The posture of a commanding officer conducting an inspection of a disaster site. I looked at my father. He was sprawled across the seat like a squatter in a penthouse, my wine staining his lower lip red, his greasy boots grinding dirt into the leather armrest he could never in his entire remaining lifetime afford to replace. He saw me watching and grinned, a wide, wet grin that showed the purple stain between his teeth. Oh, the pilot leaves her little room. He turned to Vance, dropping into his conspiratorial whisper. She rents this thing by the hour, you know, the whole setup, it's all theatre. She hired that kid up front to play dress-up and call her major. It's a show, General. My daughter is a dreamer, always has been. General Arthur Vance had been sitting still for 23 minutes. I'd counted. He suddenly slammed his briefing file onto the mahogany side table. His hands rested briefly on the leather armrests, but his jaw had been tightening with each passing insult, the muscles working under his skin like hydraulic pressure building behind a valve. And now, hearing this man call me a fraud to his face while drinking wine from my cabinet in my aircraft at my altitude, the valve blew. Vance unbuckled his seat belt. He stood up. At full height he was 6'3", 220 pounds of career military authority built across 4 decades of service that included 2 wars, 3 theatres of operation, and a Medal of Valor that he never talked about because men who earned them never did. His shadow fell over my father like an eclipse. You are lying, Mr. Gomez, Vance said, and his voice vibrated through the cabin floor, through the floorboards, through the carpet, through my boots. The crystal glasses on the bar shelf rattled against each other. The hum of the engine seemed to quiet, as if even the machinery knew to shut up when a 4-star general was speaking. My father's grin froze mid-sneer. Sarah is not an employee of some corporation, Vance continued, each word measured and calibrated, a verbal bombardment delivered with the guided precision of a man who had commanded airstrikes and never missed. She is the corporation, This aircraft is not rented. She signed the $13 million check to buy it, with her own money, from a company she built with her own hands. The blood drained from my father's face in real time. I watched the color leave, starting at his forehead and sliding down his cheeks like a curtain falling. He looked at me. I didn't move, I didn't blink. I stood at parade rest and let the truth do what truth does. No, he stammered, gripping the armrest. The leather creaked under his fingers. That's not, she couldn't have, not her, not Sarah. Vance took one step closer, his polished shoe pressed into a droplet of spilled wine on the carpet. She is a self-made multimillionaire, a decorated Air Force officer, a combat logistics veteran. She provides employment for 50 families through the company she founded, including mine. He let that sit for 3 full seconds, 3 seconds of cabin silence broken only by the engine hum and my father's shallow, ragged breathing. That means, sir, your daughter is my boss. She pays the salary of a 4-star general, and right now you are disrespecting her in her own aircraft. My father turned the color of wet cement. His mouth opened and closed without producing sound. His greasy right hand, the one he'd used to grab my bicep on the tarmac, the one he'd thrust at Vance like a weapon, began to tremble violently. The crystal glass, still holding 3 fingers of my Bordeaux, shook in his grip. The wine rippled. His fingers lost their strength one at a time, like a fist slowly opening underwater. The glass slipped. It hit the cabin floor and detonated. 1,000 sparkling shards of crystal erupted across the carpet like shrapnel. Red wine exploded outward in a dark, spreading stain that soaked into the fibers and bled toward the edges of the cabin like a wound that would never close. The sound was sharp, sudden, final, the death of a small, expensive thing. I stood there watching the wreckage at his feet. I adjusted my cuff slowly, one wrist, then the other, with the deliberate precision of a woman who had all the time in the world. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The crystal was destroyed, and everything it represented was destroyed with it. The emperor of the grease pit, the king of the VFW corner booth, the man who measured human worth in calluses and back pain. He was sitting in a $13 million aircraft that his daughter owned, corrected by a 4-star general who answered to her, and the only thing he'd managed to contribute to the flight was a stain on the carpet. I turned my back and walked into the cockpit. I slid into the left seat. I took the yoke from Matteo. The autopilot disengaged. My hands were steady. The sky ahead was purple and infinite, and for the first time in 34 years I had altitude over my father. We touched down in Norfolk in total silence. The tires barked on the runway and the thrust reversers roared, the controlled violence of deceleration pressing us forward in our harnesses. Matteo handled the taxi to the private FBO ramp. I sat still in the left seat, feeling the vibration of the wheels on the taxiway seams, watching the blue edge lights slide past the windshield. My father hadn't spoken a single word in 47 minutes. He sat in the aft cabin, slumped forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the dark red stain on the carpet where the crystal had exploded. The bravado was gone. The sneering was gone. The hand-waving, the eye-rolling, the condescending grin, all of it had drained out of him somewhere over the Blue Ridge Mountains, and left behind a 60-year-old man who looked like he'd just watched his own house burn down from the driveway and couldn't find the garden hose. The Learjet's cabin door lowered. Cold Norfolk air rushed in, carrying the sharp, salt-tinged bite of the Atlantic, the raw December wind that cut straight through fabric and skin and hit bone. We stepped onto the private FBO tarmac. The sky was low and grey. The terminal's glass doors reflected the dull afternoon light. Miss Sarah, a high, bright voice sliced through the wind like a flare cutting through fog. A 7-year-old girl in a heavy winter coat came sprinting across the concrete, her small boots slapping the tarmac, her arms pumping, a crumpled piece of paper flapping in her right hand. Her mother trailed behind, walking fast, one hand pressed over her mouth, the other clutching a tissue. I dropped to one knee, my right knee hitting the cold concrete, and caught Lily in my arms. She collided with my chest with the full, fearless force of a child who didn't know how to hold back, her small arms wrapping around my neck. She pulled back and thrust the crumpled paper at me. It was a crayon drawing on lined notebook paper, a stick figure pilot with brown hair standing next to a white airplane, blue sky, yellow sun, a lopsided red heart in the corner, and across the top in wobbly capital letters written by a hand still learning to form them, the word, superhero. "This is you," Lily cheered, tapping the stick figure with a crayon-stained finger, "because you flew the spaceship and saved me." Her mother, Emma, stood 15 feet back, weeping openly. her shoulders shaking with the grateful, broken sobs of a woman who'd sat in a hospital room and counted the minutes between her daughter's heartbeats, and listened to a doctor say *4 hours, and then watched a stranger fly through a hurricane because 4 hours was enough. My father stood frozen on the tarmac. His feet had stopped the instant Lily's voice cut the air. His arms hung loose at his sides. His mouth was open just slightly, just enough to show the confusion and the dawning, sickening comprehension that was spreading across his face like the red wine had spread across the carpet. He stared at the little girl, at the crayon drawing, at the way she clung to my neck, at the word *superhero written in the handwriting of a child who couldn't spell but knew exactly what a hero was, and was looking at one. General Vance stepped up beside my father, close shoulder to shoulder. He didn't look at my father, he looked at Lily. And when he spoke, his voice carried the low, heavy weight of a man delivering a battlefield commendation. "Do you see that little girl, Mr. Gomez? Last week, an extreme hurricane devastated the East Coast. Category 4, wind speeds that flip tractor-trailers. The FAA grounded every aircraft on the seaboard, every commercial flight, every charter service, every air ambulance, shut down. And in the middle of that, a 7-year-old named Lily was dying. End-stage heart failure. A donor heart was available in Norfolk. She needed it within 4 hours. 4 hours or she was gone." My father swallowed. The sound was loud enough to hear over the wind. Vance turned his head and locked his eyes onto my father's face with the steady, unblinking focus of a man who'd stared down dictators and warlords and was now looking at something he found equally repulsive, a father who had no idea what his daughter was worth. "Your daughter did not call anyone for permission. She woke up at 2 a.m. She drove to the hangar in the dark. She fired up the engines alone, and she flew alone through the throat of that hurricane with a transplant cooler strapped into the seat behind her and zero margin for error." He paused. The wind whipped across the tarmac and pressed against my flight jacket. "And when she landed and the transplant team took the heart, and the surgeons opened that little girl's chest and Lily survived, your daughter walked back to her jet and tore up the $40,000 invoice. She flew for free. That is how she uses her toy." My father stared at the crayon drawing in my hands, the wobbly stick figure, the red heart, the word *superhero. His eyes tracked every line, every color, every imperfect letter as if he was reading a document that overturned the verdict of his entire life. He slowly raised his grease-stained hands in front of his face. He turned them over. He studied the palms, the scarred knuckles, the black residue ground permanently into the creases and whorls of his fingerprints. 40 years of worship. 40 years of building his identity around the gospel of dirt and steel and physical pain. 40 years of telling himself and anyone who would listen that real work was defined by what it did to your hands. And now, standing on a tarmac in Norfolk, Virginia, watching a 7-year-old girl with a donated heart show him a crayon drawing of the pilot who saved her, he looked at his famous, work-cripped, grease-stained hands and saw them for what they were. Tools that fixed machines, just machines, not hearts, not lives, not souls. His chest heaved, a violent, ugly rhythm like an engine seizing. His shoulders curled inward. His face crumpled. His knees buckled, both of them at the same time. And right there on the cold Norfolk concrete, in full view of the flight crew and the general and the little girl and her weeping mother, Carlos Gomez, the toughest man in Springfield, Ohio, the king of the VFW corner booth, the man who kicked landing struts and called Learjet's toys, dropped to his knees. The impact was hard, bone on concrete, a sound that belonged in a surrender. He covered his face with those famous hands, and he let out a wail that had nothing left in it. No pride, no bravado, no contempt, just the raw, guttural animal sound of a man who'd spent 34 years building a wall and had just watched it come down in the time it took a 7-year-old to say the word *superhero. "I didn't know," he wailed into his grease-stained palms. "Oh God, I didn't know." I remained standing, my arms at my sides. Lily's crayon drawing crinkled softly in the Norfolk wind. I watched him break apart on the concrete, and I felt the specific, terrifying stillness that comes after the last round has been fired and the smoke is clearing and you realize that the war is over. Not won, not lost, over. 2 weeks passed. Inside the massive hangar of Gomez Aero Logistics at Norfolk International, I stood on the metal catwalk above the maintenance floor, my arms resting on the cold steel railing, looking down at the operation below me. Forklifts shuttled cargo pallets between staging areas. Mechanics in Navy coveralls crawled beneath the belly of a parked Citation X, checking hydraulic lines. The sharp beeping of a ground vehicle backing up bounced off the concrete walls. The hangar smelled like hydraulic fluid, fresh paint, and jet fuel, the clean, purposeful scent of a business that ran on discipline and delivered on promises. And there he was, my father, wearing a crisp navy polo shirt with the Gomez Aero Logistics logo embroidered on the left chest, tucked into khaki tactical pants with a black leather belt, wearing new boots that he polished every night in his apartment. Not a single trace of motor oil on any of them. He'd sold the rusting Ford F-157 days after Norfolk, drove himself to my office in a used Toyota Camry with 30,000 miles on it. Walked in, stood in front of my desk and asked for a job. Not demanded, not announced, asked. His voice had cracked on the word please. I gave him the title of Ground Security Manager. He arrived 45 minutes before shift, every single day. He personally inspected every cargo seal, shaking the straps with both hands like he was testing bridge cables. He memorized the tail numbers of every aircraft in my fleet before his second week. He barked at contractors who parked crooked. He reported safety violations to my operations manager before I even knew they existed. He brought his own lunch, ate alone, cleaned up after himself, and never once complained about pay, hours, or the fact that his 34-year-old daughter signed his time card. He was stubborn. He was loud. He was relentlessly particular about the way tools were organized and the way the break room coffee was brewed. He was, without question, the most dedicated employee on my payroll. Friday night rolled around. He knocked on my office door at 6 sharp, 2 solid knocks, the way a soldier knocks on a superior's door. I looked up from a logistics spreadsheet. "Let's go out," he said, jingling his car keys in one hand, shifting his weight from one foot to the other in the restless, awkward shuffle of a man who wanted to say something important but was building up to it one small step at a time. We drove in silence, not the old silence, the one loaded with contempt that ticked like a bomb. This silence had breathing room. He drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, obeying every light, checking both mirrors before every lane change. When we pulled into the parking lot, I recognized it immediately. VFW Hall, Post 1031, Springfield, Ohio, the scene of the original crime, the same heavy double doors, the same sticky floor, the same suffocating air of sour beer and floor wax and permanent resignation, the same crooked photos on the same wood-paneled walls. I pushed the doors open and stepped inside, and every head in the room swiveled. Old Hank was hunched over his usual corner booth, a brown bottle in front of him. Rusty sat across from him, picking at a bowl of bar peanuts, his ball cap pulled low. They both looked up. Rusty's eyes landed on me, and a slow, cynical smirk crawled across his face, the exact same smirk he'd worn the day he pointed a filthy finger at me and said the supermarket was hiring cashiers. He opened his mouth. My father didn't give him the chance to use it. He marched past me, crossing the bar in 4 long, aggressive strides, and slammed his heavy palm down on their table. The bottles jumped, peanuts scattered across the sticky wood. The neon Budweiser sign above the bar seemed to flicker. Every conversation in the room died mid-syllable. "Gentlemen," he roared, pointing a thick, steady finger directly at me, the same finger he'd once used to aim a steak knife at my face. "Let me reintroduce her. This is Sarah Gomez. She is an Air Force officer and the CEO of Gomez Aero Logistics. She personally signs the paychecks that feed 50 families. She is my boss and she is my daughter." The words hit the walls, bounced back and hit them again. The jukebox in the corner played a country song that nobody was listening to. The bartender stood still, his towel frozen mid-wipe on a glass. My father leaned across the table, bringing his face to within 6 inches of Rusty's. His eyes burned with a ferocity I'd only ever seen pointed at me, but the barrel had been turned outward now, and it was loaded. "If any of you ever opens your mouth to disrespect her work again, you step outside and we settle it with fists face to face, and I promise you I will not be gentle." Rusty's smirk dissolved. It melted off his face like ice sliding off a heated windshield. His eyes dropped to the table. His hands retreated to his lap. Old Hank lifted his cheap beer glass with both trembling hands, holding it up at an unsteady angle, barely making eye contact. "Respect," Hank stuttered, his voice cracking on the word like a branch breaking. "Respect, boss." I gave one slow, singular nod. I pulled a chair from the neighboring table, set it down and sat. I folded my hands in front of me on the sticky wood, the same wood where my father had once slapped the table and called me a sky taxi driver, the same booth where Rusty had told me to apply at the supermarket, the same air, the same light, the same room, but the power grid had been completely rewired, and every man at that table knew it. We walked out into the parking lot an hour later. The Ohio night was freezing, the The first breath hit my lungs like swallowing ice water, but the air tasted different, cleaner, lighter. The suffocating weight that had pressed on my chest every time I set foot in this town, that invisible, crushing mass I'd carried since I was 12 years old, and my father looked at me like I was defective for crying over a lost bicycle key, was gone. Not faded, not dulled, gone. Evaporated into the frozen Ohio sky like it had never existed. He stopped walking near my SUV. The parking lot lights threw a pale orange glow over the gravel. He shifted his weight, boot to boot, the same restless shuffle. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. His jaw worked the way it worked when he was trying to assemble words that a man like him had never been built to say. He reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a heavy object, small enough to fit in one palm, but dense enough that I saw his forearm flex under the weight. He held it out to me, his fingers trembled. "I made it myself," he whispered, his voice scraped raw, "in the shop." I took it. I held it up to the parking lot light, turning it slowly. It was a block of flawless, crystal-clear resin, about the size of a deck of cards, polished on all 6 sides until it caught the lamplight and scattered tiny prisms onto the gravel at my feet. Suspended perfectly in the center, frozen in place forever, was a jagged shard of shattered crystal, a piece of the wine glass that had slipped from his fingers at 30,000 feet and exploded on my cabin floor. I turned the block over, carved deeply into the resin on the bottom in his messy, aggressive handwriting, the same handwriting that had once scrawled asterisk old toys on a box of crushed model aircraft, were these words: "When ego shatters, love has room to take flight." I traced the letters with my thumb. I felt every rough groove where the carving tool had slipped because his hands were shaking, every imperfect edge, every unsteady line. He had made this in his workshop alone, using the only language he'd ever known, the language of making things with his hands. His eyes flooded. Not the violent, guttural breakdown from the Norfolk tarmac. This was quieter, slower, the steady, exhausted tears of a man standing on the far side of the worst thing he'd ever done, looking back at the wreckage and knowing that every piece of it was his. He placed his calloused hand on my shoulder, the same hand that had grabbed my bicep on the tarmac, the same hand that had written asterisk old toys on the box, the same hand that had pointed a steak knife at my face across a dinner table. But the pressure was different, gentle, deliberate, careful, the grip of a man who was trying, for the first time in 60 years of living, to hold on instead of push away. "I was wrong," he said, his voice broken open. "My greatest masterpiece was never the steel mold. It was you, Sarah. You are my masterpiece." I looked at the resin block in my hand. Inside, the broken crystal shard caught the parking lot light and scattered it into a dozen tiny rainbows across my fingers. He had taken the exact symbol of his ego's destruction, the precise moment his false reality shattered on my cabin floor, and he had preserved it in resin with his own hands, in his own workshop. He had turned the worst moment of his life into something that would last forever. Because that was the only way a man like Carlos Gomez knew how to say, "I am sorry and I love you, and I see you now." I have pulled G-forces that would collapse a civilian's vision to a pinhole. I have flown through hurricanes with nothing between me and the Atlantic Ocean but a thin skin of composite material and my own refusal to quit. I have commanded crew members under fire. I have signed contracts that determined whether a 7-year-old girl lived or died. I have done hard things and I have survived hard things, and I have built an empire on the principle that the hardest thing you can do is also the most necessary thing you can do. But standing in that frozen parking lot, holding a block of resin with a shard of broken glass suspended inside it, looking at the broken, rebuilt, trembling man who had spent 34 years trying to make me small, and had finally, painfully, permanently realized that I was the biggest thing he had ever created, I knew that this was my greatest victory. Not the contracts, not the Learjet, not the general's respect, not the 50 families or the combat deployments or the medals in the junk drawer. This man, this moment, this cracked, imperfect, shaking hand on my shoulder. I stepped